12 years after this great convention was born, 3 stately women gathered in the town of Little Rock, Arkansas. They had a little letter they wanted to send to the 12th setting of that convention. They had known the heartaches and the problem, and this is what they wrote. Dear brethren, in spite of the recent overflow, disaster, and the burning of that man in Texarkana, we are thankful to say, through the kindness of divine providence, we are able to send to you $15 to help serve the cause of mission in Africa. We pray continually for the redemption of the Dark Continent. 3 women sending $15 to save a dark continent. What they were saying, in spite of difficulties, of the rough wailing of evil and the groaning of the universe, and the belching of floods, we are thankful to God. I wish many of our young people could read this prayer. That's the spirit that has made this convention great. Back in the early days when this nation was being born, Crispus Attucks was the first to fall on Boston Common. A man of color, but a man dedicated to the redemption and the salvation of the colonies for the making of a great nation. He died for a cause. Nat Turner got tired of segregation, got tired of his chain. He called the group together and said, let's break a loose by force. They tried to save themselves. Fate overtook them. The destiny of the sword was measured. Nat Turner went down to defeat. But because that these women recognized, did not fail, their prayers are with us today. In spite of what happened, we go on to do our best. This is a great nation with many weaknesses and problems, but there's something here worth saving. We need not curse the nation because some segregators are here. We need not damn our souls because we have a great nation and a great destiny. It's not our job as a people to be used by folks who wish to destroy America. Take your time, examine the facts, and be slow to sit in judgment on everything American. Let destiny speak. Let time protect us. And let the eternal Father be on our side.
Hello and welcome to this Thursday night evening episode of Chad O. Jackson Live, where we're continuing our dissection of James Cone's book, My Soul Looks Back. Tonight I'm going to do something a bit different. Rather than being solo the entire time, I'm only going to be solo for the first portion of the book dissection, and then the latter half of it, I'm going to bring on maybe a guest or two to further the discussion. So we're in week 7, and in weeks 1 and 2, we were looking at who James Cone is, what his background is, what his motivation was. And we're doing this as we kind of slowly move toward the latter chapters of the book, where he gets into the meat and potatoes of marrying the so-called black church to Marxist ideology. So what we have been doing is laying the groundwork, as it were. But I think tonight is a bit of a climactic point insofar that you have this kind of butting of heads between the kind of preachers that we just saw in the countdown, Dr. Joseph H. Jackson, and this kind of new emerging quote unquote preacher that we see in the mid to late 20th century. These preachers who have more of a devotion to Marxism than to the gospel. And we're going to read about some of that tonight in this particular chapter. In fact, I think James Cone actually makes direct reference to Dr. J.H. Jackson. So yeah, thank you all who have been rocking with me so far throughout this series. I know some of it is kind of painstaking. Some of it seems kind of redundant, but again, I think it's important to kind of lay the groundwork to kind of take the scenic route as we kind of get to the meat and potatoes of what it is we're trying to talk about and what it is we want to discuss. So before we get into tonight's discussion, what I have been doing is kind of bringing up a theme or bringing up a verse or just something to think about as we kind of read through these chapters and read through what Dr. James Cone is thinking and what he's saying. It's important to lay the groundwork with Scripture. It's important to look at what saith the Lord before looking at these heretical words of Dr. James Cone, because we need to know what God's standard is, and we need to juxtapose that from what these evildoers are saying and how they wish to subvert the church. So the verse that I have for you all tonight comes from Ephesians chapter 4. I'm going to pull it up on the screen here. Let's see here. So Ephesians chapter 4. I don't know if y'all can see that. I'm actually going to read it from my Bible. So Ephesians chapter 4 is the verse I want to look at tonight, and I want us to keep this verse in mind as we're reading through James Cone's book. It says here, "We will no longer be immature like children. We will no longer be immature like children. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever that they sound like the truth. Instead, we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church." So that's how I want to set the tone tonight, right? We're looking at where he says, in particular, we won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. And that is, in fact, what James Cone is attempting to do by his own admission with his black liberation theology, which he allegedly introduced in the early 1970s. Every wind of new teaching. Should we be blown by it as the church? And I love how in this verse it talks about how some folks are so sophisticated with it, some folks are so articulate with it that you can be tricked into thinking it's the truth. But I'll let you be the judge tonight as to whether or not you think this sounds like it can be true. So anyway, I'm gonna drop that verse, and we're gonna bring it back up and reference it later. And I'll try to move quickly through this chapter. So we're at the last page of chapter 2, and we are in the first several pages of chapter 3. Now, as you can see, we're not reading the entire few pages of chapter 3. We're going to read, once again, the boiler points, because I want you to kind of get the gist of what it is he's saying. We're not going to bore you with a bunch of minutia and a bunch of nonsense, of course, because again, I want you to see what he's saying in its truest form, and not give you all the fluff that goes along with it, which is meant to, in a sense, act as the kind of sugar to help make the painful pill go down, and the pill, of course, being his nonsensical heresy. So again, I'll move quickly through this. I'll make my points, and then we'll bring up our guest this evening. So earlier in this book, we learned about who James Cone was. Once again, we learned that he was born in, I think, the 1920s, 1930s, 1920s or 30s. I can't remember which one. So he grew up in the early part of the 20th century, and in Bearden, Arkansas, which is the so-called Deep South. He said that he never experienced any racism growing up, which is weird that he admitted that, but he did. It's weird because, for someone who claims America is racist, that is systemically racist, that everywhere you turn is racism, it's weird for him to then admit that he himself never experienced racism growing up in Bearden, Arkansas. So, kudos to him for admitting that, because most people would lie and say that they did, just like Chuck and I talked about last night, the imposter syndrome or Stockholm syndrome that a lot of blacks unfortunately exhibit. He didn't in chapter 1. He did say, however, that he experienced racism when he went up to Illinois, and the example that he gives of the racist incident is when he went into a white barber shop and they didn't want to cut his hair because they didn't know how to cut his hair, and he said that was an example of racism. So the man is really all over the place when it comes to what is and what isn't racist, for one. And then two, we see that he went to seminary because he wanted to become a theologian. We saw that he accused his professors at seminary of being racist because they have traditionally given black students C's, and he wanted to prove himself. And so he studied hard, and in studying, he found that he had a writing deficiency. And so he focused on improving his writing, and lo and behold, he made an A. And so he saw him making an A as a way to show those racist white folks that he is smart, that he is intelligent. But the problem is, if they were genuinely racist, they would have never given him the A. So all throughout the earlier part of the book, we're finding holes in his logic. And then he says, after he graduated from seminary, that's when the civil rights movement was in full swing, and he was upset with the predominantly white seminaries who were not taking a position on civil rights. They weren't taking a position on social justice. Many of the white theologians, says James Cone, were not interested in marching with the civil rights leaders. They were not interested in talking about social justice in the classroom, and so for this reason he was very upset. So that's kind of where we are. He decided, I think this is the last week or two when we were in the book, he decided that he wanted to write an essay, which would later turn into a book called Black Theology and Black Power. He wanted to write an essay that would eventually turn into a book, and that's kind of where we ended. So let me pull him up on the screen. Some of y'all might not know what he looks like, so I'm going to pull him up on the screen. How do I want to do that? Let's do it this way. I want to do it that way. Whoops. Sorry if I scared any of you when I pulled that up on the screen. Let me try to do it this way. Let's see here. Okay. Alrighty, here we go. That's better. All right, so this is James Cone talking. He says, My earlier writings were critical of the eschatology found in black religion. Now, mind you, he's talking about the days before the civil rights movement, when most black pastors were preaching the gospel as it is read in the Bible. They weren't. Many of them were not preaching and teaching heresy, and this was an issue for James Cone. He wanted them to preach heresy. He wanted them to preach black power. So he took a great he took issue with that. So just to give you context, he says, my earlier writings were critical of the eschatology found in black religion because my dependency on white theology and politics blinded me of the revolutionary force inherent in the black concept of heaven. He goes on to say, and we're now in chapter 3. He says, my plans for returning to Arkansas as an AME pastor were changed, let's see here, were changed during my last years in the Bachelor of Divinity degree, when the AME bishop in Arkansas informed me that no churches were available and none were expected to come open in the near future. I was shocked and very disappointed. The issue involved not merely the availability of churches, but also internal church politics designed to prevent the Cone boys, my brother Cecil and I, from returning home. So just to give you a little context, James Cone and his brother Cecil were not particularly welcome at home because they were pushing a false doctrine. They were pushing a fraudulent gospel, and it's for this reason that even those in the AME church didn't want anything to do with the Cone boys. So I'm just giving you a little context of where we are here. So he wasn't able to find a job at the AME church back home. My brother was fortunate enough to be appointed to the Students Memorial AME Church in Detroit as a associate pastor. But when I inquired among several AME bishops about the possibility of an appointment, I was informed that nothing was available. With 2 bachelor's degrees, one in religion and another in philosophy and another in theology, and no church, and having no church, I was left with no alternative but to try to stay in graduate school for the MA and the PhD degree at Garrett Northwestern in order to prepare myself for the teaching ministry. When I was near my completion of my doctoral degree, I inquired again among the bishops, college and seminary presidents, and other church leaders about a teaching position in one of our AME churches because I wanted to remain closely identified with my denomination. While I did not expect miracles, neither did I anticipate that what appeared to me to be complete indifference to my plight. Again, I was told nothing was available. Once again, nobody wanted James Cone because of what he was teaching and what he was preaching. After being denied an opportunity to serve the AME church as a pastor and teacher, I began to think of the black church in terms that a particular denomination was much less important than what was the central theme of black liberation that ought to define the identity of all black churches everywhere. Let's see. If a black denomination did not meet the criterion of liberation theology, then it was no different from white churches and thus must be exposed for apostasy. I'm going to read that again because I butchered it. He says, if a black congregation or a black denomination did not meet the criterion for liberation theology, then it was no different than the white churches and thus must be exposed for its apostasy. Like white churches, black denominations that ignored the liberation theology of the poor as their central message were not the people of God, but rather the agents of the Antichrist. During the 1960s, Black denominations did not regard the liberation of the poor as a central theme of the gospel. By failing to connect the gospel with the bodily liberation of the poor, Black churches were preaching a gospel no different from that of white churches. For them, unfortunately, Black faith was the same as white faith. The Progressive Baptist Convention was organized in 1962, partly because of radical Black ministers' rejection of the conservative leadership of Dr. Joseph H. Jackson of the National Baptist Convention. The progressive and radical Black preachers represented a critical minority in the Black church. During the 1960s, I was disappointed with the Black churches, not because of how my church treated me personally, but because of their apparent contempt with being or for freedom. Because of their apparent contempt for freedom. I don't know why I couldn't read that. So what we just read is the fact that James, everything that I've always been saying, which is prior to the 1960s, most churches that were predominantly Black, I should say, were preaching the gospel. They weren't preaching the social gospel. Some of them were, but not like most of them were preaching the actual gospel. Most of them were preaching Christ and Him crucified, and they weren't pushing this heresy. And this was to the chagrin of one Dr. James Cone, who wanted these Black churches to preach liberation theology. We saw that he had a very difficult time getting a job in these churches because of what he was teaching and what he was preaching. And I would say that the thing that caused him to ultimately become accepted by many Black churches is the popularization of the civil rights movement. Because again, a lot of this was going on before the civil rights movement, him not being able to find a job. And some of it was going on in the swing of the civil rights movement, where a lot of Black churches and a lot of Black pastors in particular took the position, much as we saw with James Cone, Dr. J.H. Jackson in the opening countdown. And I'll play it again for those of you who didn't see. But in the opening countdown, we played a clip of Dr. J.H. Jackson where he talked about three women who were part of the National Convention and its inception in the early part of the 20th century, and how they pulled together $15 to support which was a lot of money back in those days, but they pulled together $15 of their own money and gave it to the National Baptist Convention to support a mission trip that they were doing in Africa. And says Dr. J.H. Jackson, what these women were doing was faithful, and this is what we are about as a national convention, the National Baptist Convention. We are about seeing souls saved. We are about preaching Christ and Him crucified. We go to Africa to preach Christ, not to give them some communist independence such as Dr. Martin Luther King was doing. The reason I bring that up is because Martin Luther King, along with Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And a few others, they went to go watch, or they went to go be a part of a celebration or a ceremony of sorts whenever Ghana won its independence. And it's interesting to use that language, won its independence, because really what they did was, with the help of the Soviet Union, with the help of the communists, they were able to fight off, and not necessarily fight off, the English imperialists, right, there in Ghana. And they didn't exactly fight them off as much as the English decided, you know what, y'all can have it. Like, we're not even, like, you got it. Like, that's basically what ended up happening. So the history books say that Ghana won its independence from the British imperialists with the help of the Marxists, the Soviet Union, the communists. And so, lo and behold, Dr. Martin Luther King, along with Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and others, went to go be a part of the ceremony to watch Ghana win its independence. So while Martin Luther King was taking trips to Africa, not to preach the gospel, not to preach Christ and Him crucified, he was going to watch African countries win their independence at the behest of communist support. Whereas Dr. J.H. Jackson and his contingent were marching to Africa to preach Christ and him crucified. So just an interesting juxtaposition there, right? So J.H. Jackson in the opening video, in the opening clip, said that, I have to give honor to these three women who in our early days were able to pull together money from their own humble income to help support our mission trip in Africa. And he said that, this won't be forgotten, and we're still talking about those women today. And J.H. Jackson, juxtaposes those women's action, because what they said in their letter was, look, in spite of all the flooding that prevented us from making it to the convention, in spite of all the flooding that prevented us from making that to the convention, in spite of the lynchings that we've seen, in spite of that man who was burned alive in Texarkana a few weeks ago, we still decided to pull our money together to see the gospel preached in Africa. So what Dr. J.H. Jackson is saying is these women are not unfamiliar with struggle. These women are not unfamiliar with hardship. But in spite of it all, they want to see the gospel preached. They want to see the gospel spread. This is reminiscent of their faithfulness. And he juxtaposes that from Nat Turner, who, tired of his chains, tired of his enslavement, decided to lead a rebellion. And he says the difference is Nat Turner went down in defeat, whereas these women have remained faithful. These three women have remained faithful. And, it's interesting, a time in which he gave this speech, because the rhetoric from the more Marxian preachers, as James Cone talks about in his book, was, these Uncle Tom Negro ministers have done nothing but kept us behind. They have done nothing but made us content with our conditions. They've done nothing but, da 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 da. So that was their rhetoric. That was their mentality. That was the way in which they moved. And the whole purpose of what these Marxian ministers were doing was to instill a spirit of bitterness, anger, contempt for America, contempt for white folks in particular. And they were hoping to use that anger, use that bitterness, use that frustration for social and political change. That's what their agenda was. That is what their goal was. So it goes back to the verse that we brought up earlier, where, don't be taken captive by these hollow and deceptive philosophies. Don't be blown in the wind by new teachings, because that is, after all, what James Cone decided to do. He decided to teach a new teaching that was black power, that was black militancy and the social gospel and liberation theology. He decided to teach that because he thought that was going to guarantee liberation and freedom for black folks. That's what he thought. And so he wanted to teach a new teaching, and he was upset with black churches in particular for not teaching liberation theology. And he lambasted them for teaching what he saw as a white gospel. So with that said, we're going to bring up our guest as we continue on with the show. Mr. Talib Smith. How are you today, Talib?
I'm good, sir. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Awesome.
So anyway, what do you have the book, by the way?
Yeah, I have it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what stuck out to you about, I guess, what we read this evening?
Oh man, I mean, what doesn't stick out with this book when you when you read it up and against the Word of God? It is it's heretical. It in some cases it could be something that was written today. When we have a lot of woke theology and a lot of woke churches and Marxian thought within the church, A lot of this just lines right up, with liberation theology. We've said
Mm-hmm.
this on, time and time again. But him juxtaposing white theology versus black theology, and if you're not about liberation, then you're basically digesting and internalizing white theology. So you're black on the outside, but you're Anglo-Saxon on the inside. The definition of an Oreo. So theologically, he's calling Christians Oreos.
Right.
And this is in direct contrast to the gospel. And it was funny that you read Ephesians 4:14 earlier and put it up. I was actually looking at that yesterday when I was reading over the book. And the verses beforehand, it really is what's the purpose, and why aren't we supposed to be tossed to and fro like children, in the wind? It's because there's supposed to be teaching going on and doctrine that's being given to the church that helps it to grow up into as the scripture will say, a mature man.
Mm.
So if you're mature, you're not like a child going with whatever's trendy. You're not going with doctrine that'll tell you to go, that the population is saying now go this way, go left, now go right, because your doctrine stays the same because it transcends trends. But with James Cone, it's the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Liberation is the transcendent theme within his theology, and it's his gospel, but it's a false gospel.
Right.
So I really think a lot of this could, and it's a sad thing, but a lot of this could have been written today.
Right. Right. No, you're absolutely right about that. I wanted to play once again for those who missed it, what I was referring to in terms of the kind of things that Dr. J.H. Jackson, and J.H. Jackson, obviously he wasn't perfect, none of us are, but one of the things I can really respect and admire was his faithfulness, which showed up in his preaching, and not only that, but I can admire his faithfulness that showed up in his preaching and his leadership of the National Baptist Convention with the backdrop of everything that was going on with the civil rights movement and with social justice and things of this raging all around us. You had a lot of churches who, by the day, were increasing in their support of the civil rights movement. You had a lot of college students, obviously, who were in support of the movement. You had a lot of politicians who were growing in their support of the movement, and the movement was Marxian in nature. And here you had folks like Dr. J.H. Jackson who were warning about this movement and saying, like, look, this isn't any good, and is definitely not, is the purpose of it is definitely not to further the gospel. But here's an example of some of the things that J.H. Jackson would say. And the reason, once again, it's important to bring someone like him up is because he's the one who Martin Luther King and his contingent wanted to oust as the president of the National Baptist Convention, because they wanted to get at the head of the convention and move it more toward a radical Marxian direction instead of what it was. So check this out.
12 years after this great convention was born, 3 got tired of his chain, the making of a great nation. He died for a cause. Nat Turner got tired of segregation, got tired of his chain. He called the group together and said, let's break a loose by force. They tried to save themselves. Fate overtook them. The destiny of the sword was measured. Nat Turner went down to defeat. But because that these women recognized, did not fail, their prayers are with us today. In spite of what happened, we go on to do our best. This is a great nation with many weaknesses and problems, but there's something here worth saving. We need not curse the nation because some segregators are here. We need not damn our souls because some of us are still held in shame. We have a great nation and a great destiny. It's not our job as a people to be used by folks who wish to destroy America. Take your time, examine the facts, and be slow to sit in judgment on everything American. Let destiny speak. Let time protect us. And let the eternal Father be on our side.
So, in the same vein, Talib, as what we read in Ephesians 4, particularly as it relates to not being like children tossed in the wind, being swept away by every new teaching, and you know what we see James Cone doing in terms of trying to do just that by trying to introduce a new teaching, by trying to embitter the hearts of men, the hearts of black men in particular, against the nation. It almost seems to me that that's kind of what Dr. J.H. Jackson was decrying. Is it not?
Yeah, yeah. You hear in that sermon there, it's a heart of forgiveness, a heart of redemption. You know that we're supposed to have as Christians. And you're right about James Cone. He wanted to embitter black people, and it's almost like this. If I could make up a phrase, racial existentialism. You know what I mean?
Right.
Whatever is white is evil. Whatever is black and oppressed is good.
Right.
So all you have to do is put the descriptors of white on the front of any noun, and it becomes evil. You know, all of a sudden, or imperialistic or colonial. You know, anything that has to do with anything European is evil. But yet, you know, J.H. Jackson is talking more of unifying, you know, and having a mind and a heart of redemption, you know, where James Cone is like, it's nothing to redeem. Only thing that we need to go after is our freedom. And if you notice in Cone's book, he talks about the black poor. He doesn't even care about the other poor. It's just about the black poor, you know. So there's even more of a dichotomy there. And it is opposed to the gospel, where the gospel is supposed to bring people together. In the book of Acts, you know, it brought people together under Christ,
Right.
you know, no matter what the background is. And that's the point of the gospel, that it transcends culture, that it transcends skin color and all of these differences, but it brings you together under one banner, under Christ, because we're all sinners. We're all made in the image of God. We're all image bearers. But yet and still, the Lord draws certain ones out and calls certain ones out of the world. And that makes up his church. And it's all different backgrounds and experiences and colors and languages, you know, and that's what the gospel is about. But James Cone is, as we said before, and we'll continue to repeat, that it's heretical what his theology brings about.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's basically to your point. The the repeat kind of theme throughout the book. I mean, it's just heretical. Like every other word out of his mouth is yet another heresy. And and like what's interesting to me is the fact that he's accusing predominantly black churches who do preach the gospel of being apostates. You know what I mean? So he is turning around and accusing, you know, particularly whether you're black or white, folks who do not support the social justice movement, he's accusing them of being heretical. And again, that I know I keep proving this or making this point, but it goes back to the part in Ephesians 4, where it talks about, some of these folks will say things in such a way that makes you think they're telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, for someone like myself or someone like you who spends time in the Word, we can see the heresy in what James Cone is saying from a mile away. But would you say that if you weren't a believer or if you were new to the faith, then something like what James Cone is saying would, I don't know, do you think it would be persuasive? What say you?
It could be persuasive depending on where you are. I'll say this about a true Christian. A true Christian can be deceived, and I've heard this saying before. A true Christian can be deceived, but they won't stay deceived. Because the yearning is for truth. And
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of cases, in a lot of Christians' cases out there, they'll say, I was at this particular type of church and I was believing this doctrine, but then I read this in the Bible and it was opposite of what I was being taught, and I left that church, and they begin to kind of grow in their faith. And that's what really should happen when you come in contact with James
Mm-hmm.
Cone's theology in any way, but as you progress in your knowledge of the scriptures and knowledge and digesting the word of God, yeah, your discernment becomes even more keen, as time goes on, and you'll be able to even help other Christians along, with that. And that's what the church is. That's partially what the church was about. Was following along in the apostles' instruction, in their doctrine. That was part of what it was about to grow, in the faith. That's what Ephesians 4 is talking about earlier, and being mature. We should be mature Christians and not go back to kind of these rudimentary type of thought patterns when it comes to race. And we see how they use, Martin Luther King as almost like a Marxian Black Christ, and they use it as demagoguery, to have us to be very emotive in our response and not biblical. And once we become emotional in our responses, then we're about our own cause, we're about our own, thing, and there goes the theology of the Bible,
Right.
and we're violating, and now we're putting up with this great idol of blackness, instead of putting Christ and keeping Christ in his place, we're replacing Christ with something else. But unfortunately, I think in this day and age, when it comes to the black church in general, a lot of a lot of people don't understand what they believe,
Mm-hmm.
in meaning in depth. Why, they may have a general understanding of the gospel, what the gospel entails. Jesus Christ came and he died for my sins. He resurrected on the third day, ascended into heaven. I'm saved. Why are you saved? Because I said a sinner's prayer. And
Right.
that's not biblical. Sinner's prayer is not nowhere in the Bible. But as time goes on, you should mature out of that. But a lot of black churches, they're not there to really educate their congregation and equip the congregation for going out into the world, and preaching the gospel and defending the faith and giving people a reason why they actually believe this, why their life is transformed and changed. But now it's take up a cause, go out and protest, get a sign, and let's get something political done now. That's what
Right.
Christianity is, and enacting our Christianity now. So I think a lot of us are, when we see a lot of churches these days involved in social justice movement, without batting an eye,
Mm-hmm.
or you see preachers, and there are some preachers in my city, that are big time on social justice, and black liberation theology, and they preach it as if it is the real gospel, and they truly believe it is, but they are deceiving people, and then themselves deceived.
Right. Were you ever uh, uh, part of a church that was receptive of the teachings of James Cone, either directly or indirectly?
Yes, early on in my Christianity at church that I attended was definitely in that bent, liberal. I
Oh,
didn't.
so
I,
it
of
was
course,
it
I
was
had.
direct.
It was something, you definitely seen the influence of it. It was
Mm-hmm.
definitely, it wasn't the paramount. I won't say it was the paramount thing, in the church, but it was definitely an influence in the church.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about, blackness, the community, and our people, that type of thing. So you do see, I did see that type of influence there.
Yeah. So my wife and I, when we were married, we were going to the Village Church at the time here in Dallas, which is the church that's led by Matt Chandler. A lot of people
Hmm.
might be familiar with who he is. Um, and the so we live in Dallas, and his church is in a town called Flower Mound. So to get from Dallas to Flower Mound is a hike. It's like a 45-minute drive, and we wanted to find something more local, and it just so happened to be the time where a lot of this kind of racial stuff was going on across the
Hmm.
country. A lot of this kind of woke rhetoric began to spread, and I, for one, didn't like some of the um, some of the talking points that Matt Chandler himself were speaking. I'm trying to be careful in what I say, because it's like I don't know if he's still on that right now. So, but anyway, at the time, I really wasn't feeling what he was saying, and this was in 2016, uh, which was the election year. We saw Trump and Hillary Clinton. Um, a lot of folks were pearl clutching when it came to some of the things that Donald Trump was saying at the time. And I think this kind of so when you have Obama in office for 8 years, Obama was very how do I want to put this? You can probably help me out here. Obama What Obama did when it comes to race relations in this country, I think is quite pitiful. Um,
Hmm.
the fact is, and when I say that, what I don't mean is that Obama made white people more racist because they couldn't stand to see a Negro in office. Like, no. I think that what he did was he was able to instill this kind of spirit of entitlement in a lot of blacks and other so-called people of color in this country. Just when it came to how he responded to Trayvon Martin, how he responded to, uh, you know, Mike Brown and others, rather than looking at these situations and saying, look, these kids or young men were doing things that they didn't have any business doing, and that's what happens whenever you um, whenever you are carrying yourself like a thug or a degenerate, rather
Right.
than taking the responsible route and saying the thing that needed to be said, i.e., don't be a thug, don't be a degenerate. And sure, people. I think the whole uh, issue surrounding Trayvon Martin's death are still controversial to this very day, simply because of the fact that George Zimmerman wanted to be a hero for something that he saw that looked suspicious. So, there's the details are still kind of iffy as far as that's concerned. But again, when you look at Mike Brown, who was very clearly being a degenerate, when you look at a lot of these situations, rather than and not only that, let me just say this about Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin was a one-off thing. Like, this is something that doesn't happen.
Right.
This is why it was news, because it's rare for something like that to happen, to anyone of any race. Um, and
Hmm.
so to take that one-off situation and try to paint it as if this is par for the course when it comes to being a young black man in America is dishonest.
Right.
And so that's what I mean when I say Barack Obama had a very bad take in terms of his response to Trayvon Martin. He should have acknowledged it as a one-off situation. This is something that's very rare. This, like the fact that Trayvon Martin was shot by George Zimmerman, who wasn't a white man, by the way. The fact that he was
Right.
was shot by George Zimmerman is not reminiscent of America's deep-seated racism.
Right.
This is the position that the president of the United States should have taken, if anything, or if any take. But rather, instead of that, he doubled down on this kind of rhetoric, this kind of cultural Marxian rhetoric that this is part of America's deep-seated racist history. If I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. Barack Obama acted very irresponsibly and very recklessly as president of the United
Hmm.
States on the topic of race relations. And so we have 8 years of this, and then the 2016 election comes about, and you have Trump, who is, I guess, the opposite of Barack Obama insofar that he's not pushing a cultural Marxist agenda.
Right.
And so this left a lot of ministers, a lot of pastors, a lot of churches in quite the fix, because many of them were buying into the rhetoric of Barack Obama, whether they realized it or not. And so for Trump to come along and not sympathize with that same kind of rhetoric caused a lot of predominantly white churches, a lot of predominantly white pastors to say, Trump is an example of what we don't want to be as a country. We want to be a country that is anti-racist. We want to be a country that is da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so this was a position that Matt Chandler was taking at the time. And I wasn't really feeling it. And so we left. And again, the fact that we were driving 45 minutes out of the way to go to church was one of the things that caused us to say, maybe we should look for a new church. So we started going to a church here in the town that we live in, a local church. And this was a church that at the time was touting racial reconciliation. I don't know if you remember this era in the kind of 2016. Like a lot of churches were talking about racial reconciliation, bringing the races together in the church setting and things of this nature. I didn't know this at the time, but whenever Donald Trump ran, because we didn't start going to the church till two or 3 weeks after the election, after the 2016 election. But apparently, before we came, like a week or two before we came, and Trump won the election, this church had a kind of town hall meeting of sorts, where they had their black congregants air their grievances and their fears now that Trump is president, and the white folks, the white congregants were made to just listen, to lend an ear and open arms to the black folks in the congregation. I didn't know any of this happened. I wouldn't find this out till years later. And I'm like, what? Like that, if I'd known that, I would have never started going here. And we're no longer at that church. But yeah, I mean, it goes to this whole point of like, even if the churches aren't teaching and preaching James Cone directly, they are in one way or another influenced by his kind of rhetoric. I don't know. I've been kind of rambling for a while. You can respond to any of that you wish.
No, that's right on. I think there's more influence than people realize. And you know, Barack Obama was terrible when it came to that. If we rewind the tape some, we can recall his first campaign was built around what? Hope and change. And it was supposed to be a bringing together of everybody. And it's almost as if people forget about that, how he switched up really, especially toward the end of his within the second term, toward the end of his second term, and said that basically racism was in the fabric of the country, it was woven into the fabric of the country, and now we got this downward spiral, that's dividing the country now. And who was it that it was Jeremiah White, right? That was the church that Obama went to, the real extreme.
It was, I forget the name of it, but Jeremiah Wright was the pastor.
Yeah, and we remember some of the things that he said, racially, and how extreme he was in his views. And this is who Obama was associated
not God
with.
bless America, God damn America. Yeah.
So we see the influence even there. He's wearing like kente cloth in the pulpit, and all.
You mean you don't wear kente cloth to church?
Nah, not anymore, Chad. Not anymore.
Have you ever?
No, never.
You don't? Do you own any kente cloth?
Do I own? No, I actually don't.
Okay.
No.
Good.
No, I don't need kente cloth to make me feel authentically black.
Like every time I turn around, Roland Martin or Umar Johnson are wearing some kente cloth. Like, where did y'all get that from?
Oh man,
Roland Martin's the funniest to me because one day he'll be wearing a cowboy hat, and then the next day he's wearing kente cloth. Like, What's going on?
But to your point, when it comes to Black liberation theology and its influence, on the church overall, it has definitely divided the church and been a big influence, on race relations. It's so much about the emphasis of black and white relations that it overshadows the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
It overshadows what the word of God is supposed to do and who we're supposed to focus on, and that's supposed to be focusing on Christ,
Mm-hmm.
first and foremost. When we come into the gospel, forgiveness is there, transformation is there. It's not transformed to a certain point and, oh, we have to deal with racism now.
Mm.
It's not like the leftover sin or some, oh, we need extra grace, for racism in America. But the gospel takes care of all that. Christ bled and died and rose for all of that. So it's not to say that racism doesn't exist in some way in some people, but it is not the prevalent issue of today. And
Yeah.
definitely not worthy of dividing over, especially as Christians. But the narrative is so ingrained within the Black church because I believe of the influence of Cone, but also just the civil rights movement. It's almost a badge of honor to be involved in the community in such a way that is a reflection of the civil rights movement when you're a Black
Right.
church. If you're not involved in some way in helping the marginalized or the disenfranchised in some way, then what is your true identity?
Mm-hmm.
So therein lies some of that Black liberation theology, and
Right.
you lose some cool points in the community, when it comes to that. But it's not primarily about the gospel. Now there's nothing to say that we can't have mercy ministries and go out and minister to the poor, all of, those different things that are within the bounds of scripture, but how it's done and the focus of it is not bound in race.
Mm-hmm.
It is bound in the gospel. And what's the real point? Is we're supposed to be showing forth our good works so that people can glorify our Father in heaven.
Right.
That's what it's really about.
100%. Somebody said Kente cloth is not African, it's Dutch. Netherlands clothing, uh, who traded with Africa. How do you not know that? I I didn't know that. I guess I
Yeah,
learned
I have
something
to
new.
research
I
that one. I
I guess it's because I'm neither Dutch nor African, so I guess that's how I didn't know that.
that's a
What a
that's a new
mess.
one for me.
um. So yeah, I mean, but again, my biggest takeaway from the early part of chapter 3. Where you at in the book, by the way?
Um, Around the same part, around like page 70
Got
in
you. Okay.
chapter 3. Yep.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, my biggest takeaway from that is once again, like I mean, you saw of course in chapter 2 how he kind of made it his mission um, to dispel the criticism that I think it's Washington. I forget the guy's first name, but some guy
Hmm.
last name Washington. He wrote a book where he was basically critiquing the social gospel. This rubbed James Cone the wrong way, and so he made it his mission to write a book in response to uh, that book, and that's how you ended up getting Black theology and Black power, or whatever his first book is. But again, I mean, when it comes to someone like a James Cone, I suspected that because of how he speaks, because of
Hmm.
his intelligence or lack thereof, that he this isn't a man who just was able to, from his own merit, just rise out of the bowels of Bearden, Arkansas, and amass great privilege and great positioning for himself there at Union Theological Seminary, under the umbrella of Columbia University, which is an Ivy League school. I don't see
Hmm.
this happening just off of merit alone. And of course, looking into his background, looking into who put him up to what he did, and looking into what their agenda was in terms of subverting the church, it all makes sense. That was my suspicion, and that suspicion checked out, much the same as folks like Martin Luther King, much the same as all of these others. I mean, of course, I think that they've gotten now to the point where they've created this kind of milieu where the likes of what's his name, Senator from Georgia, Warnock. They've created this milieu where folks like Warnock and others are able to, in a sense, carry the baton without having some, white, liberal, atheist theologian behind him, bankrolling him, telling him which steps to take to get to the top or to get into a leadership position. I don't think someone like a Warnock needs that per se, but you definitely did have that when it came to folks like James Cone and others. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Marxian thought, and it was the flavor of the day when it came to liberation, and that seemed to be the most viable solution, to a lot of people was, okay, capitalism has brought us oppression. So therefore, Marxian thought brings us freedom, and as long as you associate freedom with a particular ideology, a lot of people will buy into that, because as long as a lot of people buy into the fact, or think that it's a fact that they are oppressed in some way, shape, or form, then that's what they want. They want freedom, and we desire freedom, and you can understand that to a degree, but your oppression is false.
Right.
Your oppression is false, and this is a way for others to gain control in society, and you don't understand that. Okay, I'm trading my freedom out. Really, you're not gaining freedom. You're actually trading your freedom away. And your freedom of thought, your freedom of disagreeing. Like, look at the country now. How divided is it over differences of ideology?
Right.
It's not even a thing where we can have a good civil discussion over differences of ideals anymore. It's about, if you don't adhere to this idea, then you are an enemy. Now language is violence. And then if you say a certain thing to me, you're committing a violent act against me. So now ideals are becoming dangerous. And this is all that type of Marxian dichotomy of oppressed versus oppressor. And as long as we keep that ball rolling, then people will buy into it. Like, why do you think that there are so many films about freedom? When it comes to black movies, whether it's 12 Years a Slave. I just seen a preview for another movie. It was called Freedom Hair. Freedom Hair. Yeah, it's about as far as I saw from the preview, it's like about a salon.
That must just be a Philly thing.
Nah, you'll see it. You'll probably see it.
Yeah, that must just be a Philly thing.
It's about, the white, license and inspection guy comes in to close down the black owned salon, and the whole fight of, freedom and hair and all these different things. As long as you attach freedom to it, you know what I mean, you'll get some buy-in. So as long as your rhetoric surrounds that, and you can continue to call on the voice, and the experiences of the past, then black people will buy into it. Unfortunately, we don't think critically about these issues.
Speaking of freedom, Camilla Harris, she made freedom kind of the theme of her campaign, basically trying to communicate that Trump is a threat to democracy. He's a wannabe dictator. And what I would bring you is freedom. Are you gonna? How are you feeling about Camilla? You think you're gonna vote for her or what?
Absolutely not.
Hey, but Roland Martin said we need all the black men on. We need to support our sisters. We need to support our black women.
Man, that's effeminate thinking, man.
Yeah.
Black. You should have black men thinking for themselves.
Right.
Not following after women. That to me is that antithetical to
What do you
manhood.
think?
You
What
know,
do you think it's going to like? What do you think the turnout's going to be as far as black men? Like, what do you think the exit polls are going to show? Do you think black men are going to vote the same way that they have been voting, or do you think that they're going to help
it
a sister out,
depends.
or I'm sorry, pull the lever for Trump?
I think, in my opinion, I think Trump will get more of the black vote than people will realize, because a lot of people were really they were disillusioned at first, especially with with Joe Biden and all of these things, and of course the whole switching to
Did you vote
Kamala.
for
You
Joe
don't,
Biden?
yeah, no, I didn't, not at all. Never, never ever. I
Just
would
thought I'd
rather not
ask.
vote than vote for Joe Biden.
I just thought I'd
But
ask.
yeah, but I think that I think it's going to be more of a turnout for Trump. I think unfortunately the majority of black voters are gonna vote Democrat, as they usually have, because the machine is is going on all cylinders now, and then it's time to get the black vote again. But some people have been kind of awakened, because of the economy, because of what's been happening with illegal immigration, all these different things, and we'll see what happens with rhetoric. We already kind of are getting a flavor of her rhetoric and what she's
Yeah.
going to bring. I'm sure she's going to
What are
put away all of the Indian garbs and bring out all of the
the
blackness that she can right now.
dashikis? What what are the general sentiments of? Because you're in Philly. What are the general sentiments of black men in Philly about the election? Are they not talking about it? Are they feeling Camilla right now? Are they looking at Trump? What's been your kind of I guess pulse on the matter?
What I've heard has been more of a leaning toward Trump,
Mm-hmm.
from folk that I hear, but unfortunately the majority, I think, people will say things, in a moment, they'll have a realization, but when they get to that poll, it's the journey from now to the actual, time of election, that's the most intense. And you get
Yeah.
a lot of, you might be thinking a certain way, but when you get a lot of social pressure, and your neighbor and your family might be pressuring into voting a different way, you may think a certain way, but I'm gonna just vote Democrat, as I always have, and sometimes it'll just get back to default, but I've heard a lot of more, definitely more Trump, definitely more Trump talk,
What
but
about your mom?
oh man, you gonna just grill me like that on live.
How's your mom feeling about this upcoming election?
my mom's a lifelong Democrat, man.
So,
Lifelong
well,
Democrat.
you say that, but like, is she excited about Camilla,
I think
or is she just
yeah,
like, I'm gonna vote for her obligatorily?
no, I think she's excited about it. I think she's excited about it. Yeah, from what she's saying. We don't discuss too much, because we're like on different sides of the spectrum. I love her to death, though.
Right. Yeah, it's the same with my mom. My mom says she's not voting for any one of them, which I'd rather hear her say
Mm,
that. And that's my thing is like, if you don't
hmm
know what's going on, you might just want to sit this one out. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you don't,
Yeah.
if you're so easily swayed by headlines or by something you saw on social media, and you are quick to believe something just because somebody in a suit said it on TV, then you should probably just sit this one out, as far as I'm concerned. But I've long felt that
Or
way. I don't believe in mass enfranchisement. I don't believe that everybody should have
yeah,
the right to
yeah.
vote. Um, but it just irritates me when you have the. I'm not going to use the word stupid. When you have these people on social media talking about politics as if they know what they're talking about
hmm
Camilla, like whether it's a Republican talking about Camilla or a Democrat talking about Trump, more often than not, they
hmm
don't know what they're talking about, and it's like, man, this is our electorate in 2024. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, education takes work. You know what I mean? It takes, when once you have responsibility, it's work.
Hmm.
So once you're now endeavoring to find out more about your candidate, you have to really read, and sometimes read between the lines with things,
Yeah.
and not just go off of rhetoric and social media memes, to educate yourself on politics and who's the best candidate. And, this is the individual that's going to be, commander in chief of the country. So get involved in terms of educating yourself,
Hmm.
and even around local politics too. We
Right.
get really ramped up for presidential candidates and the presidential voting, but your local is really what affects you the most.
Yeah.
And those
Yeah.
those, those local laws and the school district and all of that. So yeah, and if you don't know who to vote for, educate yourself
Right.
in the
Right.
right way, and,
Yeah.
and, and not just listen to CNN.
Exactly. Exactly. The reason I keep calling her Camilla is because if you listen to urban radio and you hear all the blacks calling in, they can't pronounce her name right, so they just call her Camilla.
Yeah, baptized her with the name.
All the blacks call her Camilla when they
Oh
call into the
man,
urban radio shows. Um, so yeah, I think we'll leave it there. I'm going to have you back next week if you can come as we continue this conversation. Uh,
Lord willing.
Next week, I'll be able to start earlier in the evening. This one kind of got away from me, so that's why I had to kind of cut it short. Um, and then too, that's why I wasn't able to. That's why it wasn't really kind of like fresh and concise all the way through my breakdown, because I had to kind of pull everything together within the last hour leading up to the live stream. But I still think it was a good conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah, have you really have you gotten your I guess social media, YouTube and stuff up off the ground yet? Have you started doing more stuff, or what?
A couple things going on right now, and as things would have it, it's some issue going on with my computer right now. So
Yeah.
once
Okay.
I resolve those issues, I look to get some things up and going. I've been
Cool.
saying it for like 3 years now. So I'm like the dude on the microphone, like that's about to rap and just keep going. Hey yo, yo,
Yeah.
yo.
Turn up my snare.
Yeah. But
That's all good.
I'll let everybody know once I spit my verse.
Cool. 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 I'll be there to listen. All right, Talib. Good seeing you tonight.
Same here, brother. Thank you,
All
everyone.
right. Y'all take care.